Hello everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to cover a few last comments on Chapter 14, Dr. Moreau Explains. In the ensuing video lectures, I'm going to provide you with summaries of the major plot points of the remaining section of the text and begin to break down specific passages that will facilitate our conversation when it comes time for us to meet in our interactive class next week. In other words, it's going to be the information that we build on in order to have our conversations next week. In the context of Chapter 14, we have another shift in setting. In this novella, the setting is incredibly important in that it provides a distinction between bestial, animalistic impulses and refined, evolved human sentiments. Here, we have a kind of irony that ceases, or dramatic irony that ceases. As an audience, we had been able largely to put the pieces together to understand that Dr. Moreau's experiments, his vivisection experiments, were designed to transform animals into something that approximates, that is similar to or very much like human beings. However, Prendrick, because he's in the moment and he's caught up in his animalistic terror, this fear for his life, a material concern, is unable to recognize the thing that seems so obvious to us. Of course, Dr. Moreau is this mad scientist, vivisectionist, who is transforming animals into quasi-human beings. At this moment, that irony, that distinction between our perception and Prendrick's perceptions, or our greater knowledge and Prendrick's lack of knowledge, that's known as irony, breaks down. And suddenly we're on the same level as Prendrick. The narrator catches up to us. In a way, the narrator's perception of events is shaped by his environment. How he responds to things and the revelations of Dr. Moreau's experiments in the compound is different from how he responds to situations and stimuli in the environment of the beast people. It's almost as if our environment shapes and determines who we are. Now that seems obvious, right? That we're a product as much of nature as we are of nurture. But here, H.G. Wells is reflecting on the relationship between nature and nurture. In Moreau's speech, the primacy of nurture, as opposed to nature, is asserted. After all, he has been able to reshape through his experiments, his manipulation of a physical tissue, these creatures from beasts into something that looks very much human. It seems on the surface that nature is always going to be beaten out by nurture, as it does in the description of setting and how it influences Prendrick. Prendrick, here, in the context of the sterile, clinical, scientific, and coolly rational sitting room and scientific environment of Dr. Moreau's laboratory, becomes somewhat detached. He is no longer driven by emotion. He takes on the aspects of his environment, set apart from the beastmen, set apart from that wilderness, and becomes better able to think clearly. He's no longer with the animal men, and does not see them as men, but as animals. He's returned to the conceptual or the mental walls of a more civilized society, and so views those beast people not as something very close to men. In fact, he balks. He becomes horrified at the very thought that he could have conceived of them, or perceived them as men, or misperceived them as men. The story seems to be implying that space and location, our position in the world, and our environment defines us. The narrator, Prendrick, takes on the attributes of a hunted animal outside of those roles and shows kinship with the beast men and their terror in his flight. Here, though, there's a kind of antiseptic quality, a sterile or sterilized quality to his interactions. They become philosophical points for discussion between two civilized Englishmen sharing tea or brandy in a parlor. And he absorbs information and acts within a set of assumptions that govern that kind of space. Like the beast people, that description and that influence of space on him seems to speak to the overdetermining nature of sociological conditioning. In other words, it tells us that what we are is really just the product of our environment. Dr. Moreau believes in tabula rasa. In other words, he believes in this concept that people are born just as blank slates. That's what tabula rasa means. People don't have any instinct that can't be either ground out by evolution or by education. As he says in chapter 14, explaining his philosophy, very much indeed of what we call moral education is an artificial modification and preservation of instinct. So much of what we are is really just taking the very tenuous raw material of instinct and then shaping it through sociological conditioning. Beliefs regarding morality are really the product of context and habit. We learn from our societies what morality is, and it's not ingrained, it's not universal. It's almost like we undergo a Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning to stimuli based on different contexts. You could also look at it through the lens of The Dark Knight and what the Joker had to say about morality. He said to Batman that their morals, their code, it's all a bad joke. They're only as good as the world allows them to be. In this case, for Moreau, people are only perceptually or conceptually as good as the world trains them to be, or as their societies train them to be. If society could be modified, and if their flesh could be modified, if we could just take the tools of scientific advancement, apply it to the body and the brain, and reshape them, we could perfect humanity. However, the fact that the beast flesh, the bestial impulses and instincts that have to be suppressed by the law and constantly torn out of the creatures because they devolve back into their animalistic states constantly, has to be fought by Moreau's scientific endeavors, has to be fought by his experiments, tells us that in fact, he's completely wrong. All of us, all animals, human beings included, are subject to our animalistic impulses, our natures, that cannot be overcome regardless of the circumstances we find ourselves in. At the end of chapter 14, we have an allusion to the biblical story of the Garden of Eden that allows H.G. Wells to further emphasize the inability of human beings to escape their origins and their natures. And it reframes Dr. Moreau from a logical, rational, and dispassionate scientist to a figure that is both the creator of this strange island and all the creatures on it, a godlike figure who is worshipped by the beast people, and the very serpent or snake in the garden that destroys it. In order to understand this allusion or this reference, you need to understand something of the biblical story regarding creation. The story that H.G. Wells is alluding to here, and at several points in this text, is the one that I've referenced already. You remember that according to the book of Genesis, the first book of the Christian Bible, which is really a library of books all aggregated together, with different authors that were composed at different time periods and that are in different genres. That first book of the Bible, Genesis, contains the ancient history of the earth as recorded in the Hebrew and Christian religions. Genesis starts with the creation of the universe and includes in the second and third chapters an explanatory narrative regarding human beings and the contemporary state of the world. Now, originally, according to this story, Earth and human beings were created very good. They were created without sin, without blemish, and death was not in the world. Genesis 2 and 3, the second two chapters of this one book within the much larger Bible, exist to explain how evil exists in the world and why there is death if God is perfect. It's a good deal more complex than that, and you can have entire courses just around a few chapters in Genesis. But in brief, in chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Genesis, you have God creating the first man and the first woman, Adam and Eve. Man is created in the image of God. Now, what that entails is complex. However, suffice to say that God, in some way, imposes his image or stamps his image on human beings, makes them in a strange way as a mirror of himself. They and the world itself are very good, free from sin and its effects. God gives them dominion over the earth and gives them that command that we mentioned in relation to Montgomery: be fruitful and multiply, go, multiply, subdue the earth. That's exactly what Montgomery says to the rabbits that he lets loose on the island of Dr. Moreau. So we see how Montgomery and Moreau are kind of like the gods of this island, and they're also reframing this island as a kind of Eden. And in a way, they are. We have a small island, this pocket of the world, that is home to human beings being created. We have the structures of religion developing up around Montgomery and Moreau, and more. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden are told that they can eat from any tree except for the tree of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. God says that they can consume anything in the garden save for the fruit of that tree. In the day that they eat of that fruit, they will surely die. Adam and Eve are content to obey this command until a serpent enters into the garden, or the serpent arises in the garden and begins to speak to them. Now, Christians view this serpent as being the devil or Satan. The devil convinces Eve to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. She does so and then shares it with her husband. As a result, the two of them are cursed and cast out of the garden. In order to understand what's going on here and to tie it into the story that is being presented to us in the island of Dr. Moreau, we need a little bit more background information about Satan himself. In the book of Isaiah, which is about 24 books down the line from the book of Genesis, and it includes basically prophetic utterances regarding the coming of the Messiah, Jesus. Also warnings and other materials, but that's beyond really the scope of what we need to know. Isaiah, this prophet, refers to some kind of historical figure who is oftentimes associated with the devil or viewed as a kind of proxy for the devil, a stand-in for the devil. This figure is known as Lucifer. In this book, Isaiah says, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. Basically, what's being said there is that Lucifer, this person, has had the sin of pride, or expressed the sin of pride. He has been cursed and thrown down to the ground. He's been cast down because he said, I will make myself like God. I can overcome God. I can rebel against God and become supreme. I can rule over God. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. Lucifer then, according to this passage, who is believed to represent Satan, rebels against God and is punished for it. He is the very definition and the very first rebel against God. In Genesis, as he tempts Adam and Eve to sin and convinces them to rebel against God's orders, he essentially takes the image that he possesses, the image of a rebel, and stamps it on them, conforming them to his own image. Rather than bearing this image of God, in a way, they now bear the image of their new father, the devil, who has reshaped them as rebels against the divine order. This idea of stamping your image on things should be familiar to you because it's referred to at numerous points in the context of... Now, this idea of stamping your image onto something, or stamping the image of God, stamping the image of man, stamping the image of a rebel onto another person or onto something, should sound somewhat familiar to you, because it's at the heart of the island of Dr. Moreau. The mark of the beast, that image of the beast that can never be effaced, can never be sort of washed away, is on all the creatures. And Prendrick describes what Dr. Moreau is trying to do in terms of the image of man being stamped onto the beast people. So in chapter 15, when the beast folk's children lived, Moreau took them and stamped the human form upon them. So immediately after chapter 14, Dr. Moreau explains, where there's a reference that I'll begin to unpack about the Garden of Eden, Satan, and the serpent. Immediately after that, we have the idea of the human image being taken by the godlike figure Moreau and stamped onto the beast people. There was no evidence of the inheritance of their acquired human characteristics. The females were less numerous than the males, and liable to much furtive persecution in spite of the monogamy the law enjoined. So, we have that idea, as from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, about God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea." So, Montgomery and Moreau, particularly, are kind of like the gods of this island. They're stamping the human image, their image, onto these creatures. The serpentine monster that Moreau describes in chapter 14, one of his few non human creations, is described in the following terms, and it frames Montgomery and Moreau particularly not just as the gods of this island, but as the ones who destroy it. The ones who bring into this island creation and life, but also death and destruction. The serpent, or this serpentine S-like creature that slithers around the ground, limbless, was a limbless thing with a horrible face that writhed along the ground in a serpentine fashion. So we already see those connections to Genesis with the serpent in the garden, a serpentine fashion. We already know the island is connected to the Garden of Eden based on what Montgomery had to say. It lurked in the woods for some days until we hunted it, and then it wriggled into the northern part of the island. One of my men had a rifle, and when his body was found, one of the barrels was curved into the shape of an S and very nearly bitten through. Strangely enough, even though this creature, this limbless serpentine creature with a horrible face, is the least human of Dr. Moreau's creations, in a way, it's also the most human, and it's most like Moreau himself. Moreau, as this godlike figure, has been driven to reproduce his image, to stamp the image of humanity on all these creatures that we've seen, transforming beasts into men, failing along the way. This creature, the serpentine creature that he creates, is doing the same thing. It kills a man and then reproduces its own serpentine, slithering image by bending the gun barrels into the shape of an S. Now, that's obviously meant to be symbolic, rather than some kind of conscious attempt on the creature's part to reproduce its own image. But couched in that idea of Satan, the serpent in the garden, stamping his image on men, turning them into the rebels here, we have this serpentine snake writhing about in the garden, stamping its S-like image onto things. And it's doing exactly what its father, God and Satan, in the form of Moreau, has done, stamping his human image on people. So Moreau, in creating a creature in his own image, in trying to reshape animals into men, is also, like Satan, bringing forth a kind of corruptive influence that destroys. He has within his experiments the seeds of his own destruction and the seeds of the destruction of everything that he's worked for and the humanity that he strives to recreate. His project is doomed from the start. It's the same as Montgomery. Montgomery teaches Maling how to cook meat and to prepare it. He's also the one who brings the rabbits onto the island that foster the bloodlust of the beast people. So, when we look at Montgomery and Moreau, we see not just gods, but also, through these series of illusions, devils. They're one and the same. In future video lectures, try to keep these ideas in mind about what the story is saying about Moreau and Montgomery, and how that might tie into the work's commentaries on their moral systems and beliefs.